I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we hear from a journalist who was just on the ground with Ukrainian forces in Kursk, Russia, reflect on the latest battlefield and political developments, and look deeper into Putin's recent foreign trips, and reflect on what it tells us about the tensions in Russian society.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 23rd of August, 2 years and 186 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant, regular on the Telegraph's Moscow desk and editor of the Central Asia and South Caucasus Bulletin, James Kilner, and freelance journalist, fresh from his very own incursion into Russia, Tom Much. I started, however, by reporting the latest updates from the battlefields of Ukraine and Russia. So let's start in Kursk, where Kyiv's audacious operation continues. Contrary to much initial speculation, there is now strong evidence, as we predicted, that Ukraine does indeed intend to stay in Russian territory for some time, though how much time will depend on the scale of the Russian response. Kyiv has now advanced 28 to 35 k's into Russia's Kursk Oblast as the incursion enters its third week. That's coming from Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, Oleksandr Syrsky. There is remarkable footage doing the rounds this morning, allegedly showing Ukrainian servicemen in Kursk proposing a mock toast to the restoration of Ukraine's original territories from an administrative office in the region, complete with miniature Russian flags on the table and images of Putin on the wall. Concrete shelters, we also learned today, are being constructed in the Russian city of Kursk as Ukraine advances towards that settlement. Now, the Institute for the Study of War in Washington is saying Russia is now trying to address its border security vulnerabilities following the incursion. Yesterday, Putin met with officials from Bryansk, Kursk and Belgorod Oblasts, along with other Russian officials, to discuss the situation in those regions bordering Ukraine amid the Ukrainian incursions. During the meeting, the Bryansk Oblast head reportedly requested federal funding for its regional forces to reduce the burden on regional budgets and encourage participation by offering regular wages. The Belgorod Oblast head also chimed in and supported that, and Kremlin officials, including Putin, indicated they would work towards providing federal funding. The reason I mention this at the top is, will money be enough, or will it require troops from the Russian armed forces currently stationed in Ukraine? That is a key question, as the Russian border is evidently vulnerable, as this incursion has showed. Another key question, more urgent in the short term, is the number of troops Russia redeploys to tackle Kursk. In the past 24 hours, the Russian military has recently redeployed elements of at least one airborne regiment from western Zaporizhia Oblast in response to the incursion, seeking to stabilise the area and improve command and control over conscripts. Reports suggest that elements of the 56th Airborne Regiment were moved from Zaporizhia, and footage has shown Russian military equipment being transferred from Crimea to Kursk. A Russian mill blogger also claimed that elements of the 56th and 11th Airborne Brigades are operating near the border. As Dom reported yesterday, Moscow is striking its own soil in Kursk in an attempt to get a handle on the situation. But elsewhere, the Ukrainian Air Force Commander, Lieutenant General Oleshuk, reported that Russian forces launched 10 Shahed drones from Kursk Oblast against Ukrainian positions in Kyiv Oblast last night and the night before, with Ukrainian forces shooting down 2 drones. The use of Shaheds for frontline strikes may suggest, the ISW says, that Russian forces are adapting their tactics due to a reduction in glide bomb strikes following those attacks on Russian airfields. Ukraine is also believed to have advanced almost 2 square kilometres deep into that frontline area after launching a counterattack in Kharkiv Oblast. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade said its forces had seized control of a battalion defence position held by Russian troops, along with several strongholds. Now, we'll be hearing from Tom, who was just on the ground with Ukrainian troops, very shortly. But before we go to him, it's important to reflect on the Russian advances within Ukraine itself, as so far there's been little evidence of that relenting despite the events in Kursk. Recent Russian advances near Petrovsk in Donetsk and have led to Ukrainian withdrawals from some positions southeast of the town, we understand, although Russian forces have not achieved their goal of encircling Ukrainian forces. Russia would appear to have reverted to their old tactic and levelled the salient east and southeast of Petrovsk, but without settling conditions for a tactical encirclement. Ukrainian forces managed to withdraw in an organised manner, it would appear, avoiding significant losses, and there have been no widespread reports of any retreats or Russian forces successfully encircling any units in that area, as some feared. Now, I should flag that General Ben Hodges, the former commander of US forces in Europe and, of course, a well-known commentator on the war, including once or twice on this podcast, is sceptical of some of the alarm around Petrovsk. He's pointed out, and I quote, "Russia has advanced only 50 k's from Avdiivka towards Petrovsk in 6 months at enormous cost. I trust the Ukrainian army's judgment here on allocation of resources. Some observers in the West are more concerned about that location than experienced Ukrainian commanders." Now, that might prove to be overly optimistic, as many people we've heard from in recent days are extremely concerned about the situation there. But there is some, and I emphasise that word to underscore its speculative nature, some speculation that pace of Russian operations is decreasing across most of the theatre, although the reasons for that are unclear. Ukrainian brigade spokespeople in Petrovsk and Chasiv Yar directions reported a decrease in glide bomb strikes and Russian aviation activity in the past 24 hours. The Ukrainian General Staff has also noted a reduction in Russian combat operations in western Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblasts, likely due to the redeployment of forces, but we cannot be sure. The shifting focus of Russian military operations suggests a strategic adjustment, but it is too early to say. So that's the situation, everyone, on the military front. Though do keep an eye on our website and live blog over the weekend, as every day counts at the moment and things are very fast moving indeed. Just as a nod to history, today marks the anniversary of the end of the original Battle of Kursk in 1943, after 1 month, 2 weeks and 4 days. Will Ukraine's battle there last longer? It would appear that might be the strategy, but of course it remains to be seen. Now, in the political realm, as I flagged yesterday, all eyes are on Modi's visit to Kyiv today. I won't repeat all that I said about the Indian position of the war yesterday now, but for those interested, do listen back to Thursday's episode. There is concern that he is more aligned to Russia than the West on this conflict, but there does seem to be a decent relationship with Zelensky as far as body language is concerned. The pair embraced today, and there are photos of them talking, with Modi placing his hand on Zelensky's back. The Indian Prime Minister has tweeted, after visiting an exposition of the martyrs, that conflict is particularly devastating for young children. My heart goes out to the families of children who lost their lives, and I pray that they find the strength to endure their grief. Now, whilst that's a sentiment few would deny, it is a statement that could have been made at any stage since the invasion, which in and of itself exposes India's concern of saying anything too controversial publicly, I think. He went on, I look forward to the opportunity to share perspectives on peaceful resolution of the ongoing Ukraine conflict. As a friend and partner, we hope for an early return of peace and stability in the region. Now, the team will report on Monday if anything else comes out of that meeting other than those kind of words. I imagine most of the important work will be done behind closed doors, but there may be a joint press conference, so we shall see. And just finally, before we hear the view from Kursk itself, it's been a few days since we've reflected on the United States. Last night saw Kamala Harris accept the Democratic nomination, and in her speech she made clear the dividing line between her and Trump's Republican Party. To quote her directly, as president, I will stand strong with Ukraine and our NATO allies, she said. I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump, because they know he's easy to manipulate with flattery and favours, because he wants to be an autocrat himself. That will no doubt be a relief for many Western leaders to hear, as will the news, especially in Kyiv, that the US will send around $125 million in new military aid to Ukraine amid the incursion. The Biden administration's package will include air defence missiles, HIMARS, munitions and javelins, as well as anti-drone equipment, and named officials have told the Associated Press. An announcement is likely to come later today, the day before Ukraine's Independence Day, as the US warns of a possible uptick in Russian attacks to coincide with that celebration. The aid, which will be taken from Pentagon stockpiles for faster delivery, is also expected to include anti-armour missiles, counter-electric warfare systems vehicles, and 150mm and 105mm artillery ammunition. So, lots going on, but let's turn to Tom now. Tom, thank you very much for coming on and for your patience. For those who are not familiar with your work as a journalist, can you just tell us very briefly about yourself and then what you've been up to for the last few days?
Hi, Francis. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm actually from New Zealand, and I have been the correspondent here more or less for the New Zealand Herald, our biggest newspaper, for a while now. I also write for the Daily Beast, Open Democracy, Byline Times, among others. And actually, I just spent the day yesterday in Sudzha with Ukrainian forces, getting a little tour around the town. It's a little bit amusing for me to be in Russia because about 2 months ago, I was actually officially sanctioned and blacklisted from the Russian Federation in perpetuity, apparently for my role in helping foment a Russophobic campaign in New Zealand, along with a few other politicians and journalists. I don't think when they made that ban, they thought that it would only last about 7 weeks.
Remarkable. So let's start there then. And obviously, you've pronounced it correctly there. Many of our listeners will know it as Sudzha, based on the Anglicized spelling and the way it's being pronounced in the media here. But what was the mood like? I mean, it must have been pretty extraordinary to be amongst the Ukrainian troops. Do they get a feeling of momentum? Do they feel the initiative is with them? Or do you get the sense now that things are winding down? Fascinated to hear your perspective.
I've got to be honest, I got the feeling among the troops that while they were very pleased with what they had accomplished, they looked excited, they looked bullish, they looked hopeful, which if you've spent a lot of time, for instance, in the trenches in Donbass, you will find that soldiers there are not always that bullish or that hopeful. And they felt that they had the initiative. However, and they were quite tight-lipped about their plans, they didn't seem like that they were going to be expanding any further, particularly in the direction of Sudzha. I thought it was interesting that one of the things we did see coming along the road was not just tanks and regular armoured vehicles, but excavators as well. And those are the things that you use to dig trenches. And you're not really going to be digging trenches unless you're planning to entrench where you are and stay there. So while they were very happy, they didn't seem like they were in the mood to suddenly branch out and go further. Additionally, a few of them did make reference to the situation in Kursk and in Donetsk, which is at the moment not looking particularly promising, noting that Ukrainian forces there were pretty outnumbered and pretty outgunned.
Fascinating. And just paint a picture for us of the kind of things that you saw. Is there a lot of devastation is too much, but is there a lot of destruction from the operations that there have been in that part of Russia? Did you see any locals? Are they out and about? Is life going on? Is this very much a settlement under occupation and you only see the Ukrainian troops?
So when you get out there, it does look pretty desolate, and you get there, you're in an armoured vehicle. We piled out. It was a very small group tour, about 5 different news channels. We pile out onto the main square, which is covered in glass. There are trees that have had their branches blown off. There's that destroyed statue of Lenin. His name is crossed out, and a very offensive Ukrainian curse word has been written down below it. You see some graffiti like Ukraina ponad uсе, which basically means Ukraine above all. It's an old nationalist saying. And the streets are pretty deserted. However, at one point we did get to see quite a few civilians. So the troops got a call saying that there were basically drones in the sky and we needed to head to the nearest shelter. And that shelter was actually full of Russian civilians. They seemed like they had food and water and medicine and what they needed. They obviously didn't look happy. They looked very, very scared. I mean, if you see shelters in Ukraine now, people are often miserable, but they don't look particularly shocked or frightened often because they've simply been in this situation for so long. Here, people look very skittish and very nervous. One thing I did find very interesting was a conversation we overheard between one of the local Russian civilians and one of the Ukrainian soldiers. They were asking, you've been living next to Sumy, you've been living on the border of a country at war, what do you think about it? And the guy was like, oh, we're just simple, peaceful people. We don't have any interest in politics. We know it's all nonsense, blah, blah, blah. And at the same time would say there's no point voting, there's no point protesting because nothing is ever going to change. The people in power are always going to do what they're going to do. So we just ignore it and live our lives and not put our heads above ground. And the soldiers grunted and he said, yes, not political, right? Which is often what Russians who might be against the war will say. They're like, oh, we're just not political, we don't get involved. And for the Ukrainians, effectively, what they think often is the fact that these people are not political is what has allowed Putin to get away with the terrible crimes that he's done in Ukraine. So I thought that was quite an interesting interaction, a sort of a snapshot into the Russian mentality that we got from talking to some of these people.
Fascinating. I'm going to bring Roland in very shortly, of someone, of course, who's been to many sites of battlefields and active operations. But before I do, just one final question from me. Did you get a sense that the Ukrainian forces felt that they would be attacked at any moment, whether from the air or from ground forces? Did it feel quite a relaxed atmosphere, or are people very much on edge in terms of the soldiery?
People are pretty on edge. They know that there's going to be some kind of retaliation. Just a sort of an interesting little anecdote is that apparently the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is, and I can't confirm that this will be going forward properly, is not actually going to be taking any more journalists into Suja for the moment because of the increased security risk. I remember as soon as we got to the border, the officer who was leading our tour got out and was talking to the soldiers on the checkpoint who say, yes, it's getting more and more dangerous every day. And they were actually 50-50 on whether to go ahead with the trip. And we ended up doing it, but we ended up spending about half the time of that trip in a basement waiting for the Russian drones overhead to go away. You can still hear a lot of fighting. It's not as intense as, say, it might be if you've done work in Bakhmut or in Kherson or something. But there's definitely a feeling of this could be the calm before a very big storm.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for painting that picture for us. Roland, I'm going to bring you in here. I imagine you have some questions for Tom as well.
I was going to ask, how imminent does a Russian counterstroke feel, and how dangerous does it feel, and how audible is the fighting? Because the Ukrainians are, Tom will know this, they're quite restrictive with where they'll let you go and where they'll take you, and they're quite touchy about letting journalists put themselves in danger. And there seems to me to be two kind of ways of looking at what's going on in Kursk. Either the Russians are going to try and just swallow it, just contain the Ukrainians there, say, okay, it's just a bit of countryside, we don't have to worry about it too much, or they're going to put in a big effort to try and get it back and put in a major counterattack. And Tom, it sounds to me like from what you're saying, your impression is that, or the feeling amongst the Ukrainians on the ground there is that probably a counterattack is coming.
Yes, but then again, it would be sensible for them to take as many precautions as possible, even if it's not confirmed that the Russian counterstroke is coming quite now. Of course, you're completely right that when you go around with Ukrainian forces, they're often pretty tight-lipped about operational security, and in some senses, rightly so. One of the reasons that this operation was able to be as successful as it was because of such tight operational security. They're also often very worried about your safety. They'll be like, okay, make sure you look at everywhere you're going. There could be like unexploded ordnance absolutely everywhere. You sometimes feel like they're almost a slightly overprotective babysitter or something like that.
Thank you very much for that. And just, you must be, I'm not sure where you are actually now. I'm assuming you're back in the Sumy or somewhere else. What's the sense on the other side of the border? I've been watching some of the Russian military telegram channels this morning talking about how they're trying to intensify strikes on the Ukrainian rear in Suja to disrupt the Ukrainian logistics supporting this salient they've created. Can you feel the war in Sumy as well?
So I'm back in Kyiv now, but I did spend a while in Sumy. I also did a tour around the sort of the little Ukrainian border towns very near to Suja. And one of the things that was very interesting was that you could hear actually very little. You couldn't hear any artillery. You couldn't hear any drones. However, there were a lot of buildings that had just been absolutely smashed to bits. We asked the soldiers what they were, and they're like, they're all carbs. They're all glide bombs that you'd just be minding your own business, and then all of a sudden there's just this huge explosion. And of course, carbs, because they can be fired from quite a way away across the Russian border, there's not a hell of a lot you can really do about one if it comes towards you. Now, in Sumy itself, when I talked to civilians, they were pretty pleased about what had gone on, but they noted that there'd been a pretty significant uptick in strikes in the city of Sumy itself, and that while they were pleased with what the Ukrainian army had been doing, they were more and more concerned for their own safety.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for your reflection, and Roland for your questions there. Of course, Tom, you're very welcome to stay on our broadcast for as long as you like, but I'm also aware that you're a very, very busy man. Roland, I just want to just go back to you before we speak to James about other urgent matters as well. You've been, of course, as we spoke to you about earlier in the week, been looking at the Ukraine front quite explicitly, Pokrovsk and other places. Have you heard anything more? I obviously at the top of the episode was talking about some speculation that operations may be slowing down there, other reports that things seem still incredibly precarious. Just wondering if in the past 48 hours you've heard from any of your contacts or anything else that might be indicative or interesting.
I mean, everything that we're hearing at the moment, and we've been speaking to some civilians in Pokrovsk. We're in the process of being in contact with some soldiers in the area. All of it points towards the situation just feeling precarious. Right? The accounts of people inside, civilians inside the town, it just reminds me so much of this kind of pattern that we've seen elsewhere throughout the war, from Severodonetsk to Bakhmut to Avdiivka. The sense that the war is getting closer. There's shells hitting the outskirts of town. It's much louder. Things have begun to close. One of our colleagues has been speaking to a bank manager in Pokrovsk who is trying to stay open for a bit because soldiers rely on the bank to get some cash. But the sense that not quite sure how long one can hang on. And the thing is, we've been through this so many times. It does take on a sense of inevitability in a way. You can see the early signs of the rising tide of the Russian advance. And, you know, it's not impossible they'll be stopped, but you just know that whether it's weeks or months on the current trajectory, the Russians are going to take that town. I was reading an update from the Center for Defense Strategies, a Ukrainian military think tank. Let's actually bring it up. I just want to read one paragraph from their latest update. So this is their update from yesterday. On the Pokrovsk direction, the enemy is completing the first stage of their offensive operation and will soon regroup forces in the operational zone of their center operational grouping. It's the Russian center operational grouping. Now, listen to this. Units of the Russian 27th Motorized Rifle Division of the 2nd Combined Arms Army and the 114th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 51st Combined Arms Army have not only fully eliminated the Ukrainian Tavria operational strategic grouping's bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Vovcha River, and that's one of the rivers in that part of Donbass on the approach to that area around Pokrovsk, but also advanced significantly westward towards Novoselivka, Pershka, Komishevka, reaching the Mykolaievka, Chichi line. I'd advise listeners just open the deep state map to find these spots. And preparing to break through the northern outskirts of Seldovia to approach the Karlikov-Seldovia highway in the north. These tactical gains have secured the enemy's left flank. So look, there you have it. I think the bottom line is that on that part of the front, and specifically on Pokrovsk, we've seen things slow down a bit in Chasiv Yar. We've seen things, as you said, we've seen an airborne unit transferred from the Zaporizhia front to Kursk, but certainly on Pokrovsk, but also on the Toretsk area in Donetsk, it looks like the Russians are determined to push forward and exploit any weakness they can at the moment.
Well, thank you very much for that, Roland. And it's a pleasure to bring on James Kilner now. James, you, of course, are our man reflecting very much on the situation in Central Asia and indeed the Caucasus and Russia itself. I wanted to start, if I may, with Russia itself. It's been very interesting seeing Putin's movements of late. I've reported for the pod on a trip to Azerbaijan. Of course, we've had the trip to Chechnya as well this week. Just fascinated on your perspective on this. What is Putin doing from your perspective, and how has it been received by the Russian public and indeed the peoples in those places that he's been visiting?
Hi Francis, nice to be back as ever. Let's start with this trip to Azerbaijan on Sunday and Monday. This was, as I'm sure you filled in your listeners, the first time Putin's been to Azerbaijan since 2018. So that in itself is significant. And in the wider context of the war in Ukraine and the pressures he's under in Kursk, it takes on additional significance. The initial reaction to this state visit by Putin to see Ilham Aliyev in Azerbaijan is that Putin's looking to deflect from his problems in Kursk and elsewhere. But when you dig into it, you very quickly realize there's a very strong practical reason for Putin to be in Baku. Azerbaijan is playing, you could say they're playing both sides of this conflict extremely well. They nearly doubled, or they were aiming to double the gas supplies to the EU when the EU cut contracts with Russia and looked for an alternative source of gas, and that was Azerbaijan. And at the same time, Azerbaijan's also increased its own imports of gas from Russia. So in many ways, I'll let your listeners decide for themselves. It's in many ways a gas war. But alongside this, Azerbaijan is also playing a key link in something called a north-south transport corridor that Moscow and primarily Delhi are setting up. And it has become so important for Moscow since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22. And to facilitate this, Azerbaijan and Russia are spending a lot of money improving or actually fixing a rail net link across the border right next to the Caspian Sea. So that is one critical piece of infrastructure. And during this trip, which was a very jovial trip, Putin and Aliyev were smiling and laughing. There's photo shots of the two leaders enjoying a sort of casual dinner, tireless casual dinner. But the briefing to the Russian media and the briefing from Kremlin insiders was business is top of the list in this one. A lot of the Western media went away and said, actually, this is Putin power play trying to regain influence in the South Caucasus, especially around the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. So is probably the right way of putting it. Move towards a ceasefire there and conflict there, which has been going on for a few years. If you remember, Russian border guards stood aside last September when Azerbaijani forces launched a surprise attack on the remnants of the Armenian population living in Nagorno-Karabakh in the town of Stepanakert and chased them out, basically. And so a lot of the Western media was saying this is Putin's play to regain influence. I don't say it like that. I think it was really business and trying to pull Azerbaijan closer into its sphere of influence, indeed. We've actually had confirmation of this week. A couple of days, so Putin finished his visit to Azerbaijan on Monday. Within 2 days, Azerbaijan had applied to become a member of BRICS, this economic group that is centered around Moscow, China, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil. Putin sees this as an alternative economic group of the so-called global majority, anti-Western group, and he's increasingly trying to frame it in that context. And Russia is hosting a summit, a BRICS summit in Kazan later this year. So Azerbaijan has applied to join this club. Iran is a member, UAE is a member. So they are taking new members, but this is quite a big move. And traditionally, this is also a key point here, Francis, Azerbaijan has not particularly been very keen on joining orientated Kremlin-driven groups. It's not a member of the Kremlin's Eurasian Economic Union. It's not a member of the Kremlin CSTO security group. It has recently this year applied to become a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a security group focused on Central Asia run by China and Russia. which is widening out its membership. But previously, it hadn't been particularly interested in joining this group. It has also applied to become an observer member of that this year, which is going up the ladder towards full membership. So there is definitely a sense, I'd say, Francis, that that Putin and the Kremlin see Azerbaijan as a potential influential ally. Azerbaijan is hosting COP29 in November, the UN's climate conference. It's become a key, as I was saying earlier, a key gas supply to the EU. So its place in the world is growing in significance, and the Kremlin sees it as a potential ally.
That's so interesting, James. Thank you. And it's those kind of insights that we rely upon from you, because as you say, most of the speculation has been that this was really just about optics, but clearly there's another priority there as well. Let's look at Chechnya then, a country, of course, that you know a lot about, and indeed we've been talking about on this podcast for a considerable amount of time. No need to, I think, go into all of the context of Chechnya, but what did you read from that visit that Putin made, his first time there also for a very long time?
That's right, Francis. First time since 2011 to Chechnya, and importantly, first time since 2008 to Beslan, which is the little town in North Ossetia, which was attacked in 2004 by Islamic terrorists after a 3-day siege, which killed 333 people. The Kremlin eventually got control of this school that they captured. I think this is a really important trip, definitely. A couple of key reasons. So we've been reporting for the last year that Kadyrov is ill, he's under pressure, he's lining up his sons to take over from him. Putin flying down there or coming back on his way from Azerbaijan was his way of backing Kadyrov and his way of saying, I don't think this guy's on the way out, this guy's here to stay. Kadyrov, as you guys know, is a sort of Putin wants in Chechnya to keep the peace, really. It's a deal. Putin sends a lot of money Kadyrov's way. Kadyrov uses his thuggish security forces to keep everyone in line. So I think for Putin, it was really important to get down there and to show his support for his man in Chechnya. There's some photos of Putin touring Russian Special Forces base at Gurdomez, which has become one of the key military schools in Russia since the war started. A lot of their more able soldiers go through the Gurdomez Special Forces School. They only get about 2 weeks training, but it's substantially more than your average recruit. But there's some photos of him looking around, and he's been shown around by one of the Chechen commanders who's been very mouthy about what happened along the border in Kursk. If you remember, there's been quite a lot of allegations that Chechens fled the border duties and left it to conscripts, and this particular commander was mouthing off about Russian conscripts. But he was the man who was showing Putin the various Western military kit that the Chechens have alleged to have captured in Ukraine. So again, that sort of nod to certain people is really important in the way that Putin operates. And he's putting it out there that he backs this guy. Really importantly, in the same photo, Adam Kadyrov was present. This is Kadyrov's youngest son. I think he's about 16 or 17. Him and his brothers have been promoted steadily over the last 18 months or so, really. But Adam is been touted as Kadyrov's favourite and maybe being lined up to take over from him. Just him being in the picture, in the photo, and not the other sons is quite important. I would go as far as that to say. On Beslan, for me, part of the Beslan trip, Putin went and knelt down on both knees at a memorial for the children or people killed in this terrible siege. And it's a terrible sight. If you go there, they've left the school all burned and the gym where these poor children were imprisoned or held hostage. And there's bottles of water there because they're all parched with thirst. Putin went and knelt down at a memorial to victims of that tragedy. And then later went and supposedly spoke to mothers of children who were killed in that disaster. It was all tightly controlled, and the videos showed Putin talking but not the questions. And apparently the mothers of the children killed were only given 24 hours notice, and they were handpicked, and there was only 3 of them. So as we know, the Kremlin tightly controls this sort of thing. But what the message is meant to send to ordinary Russians, I think, is that Putin is trying to say, I care about your children. I'm kneeling down at this memorial where children were killed. I'm speaking to mothers again. And this comes in the context of sending conscripts to Kursk to try and kick out the Ukrainians, which is a very controversial thing to be doing. Conscripts are legally allowed to fight inside the borders of Russia. But there is like a social contract in Russia where families entrust their young, callow sons to the military as a sort of rite of passage, and they don't really expect them to be involved in frontline combat. Putin is testing that. So I think he's basically having to go out there and say, look, I still care. So I think in that context, that this was an important PR trip for him, Roland.
Thank you, James. So interesting. And just one final, very brief one, if I may. As I mentioned earlier on and earlier in the week, there has been some reporting that Putin has been seen out and about in public more since the Kursk invasion. Of course, this event in Chechnya would speak to that, but I think it's more about wider Russian citizenry. It may be the answer is no, but have you seen much evidence that Putin's been speaking to the public more rather than being seen behind closed doors in the Kremlin?
I think these walkabouts he does are so heavily choreographed that their only real value is for Kremlin propaganda. He's in and out. He suddenly walks towards a crowd surrounded by bodyguards. It'd be a hand-picked crowd, and he might shake someone's hand and say something for the camera, and then he's back again. Yeah, I mean, he tends to do this when he feels like he's in trouble. There was definitely a couple of incidences after the Wagner mutiny last year where he made a point of going down to Dagestan, for example, to have a bit of a walkabout. So some people accuse him of using doubles. We don't know about that. I think if people are detecting an uptick in supposed walkabouts, maybe you could read into it that he's using a shorter's position. I'm not fully convinced by that argument. I just think it's something that he feels he has to do sometimes. Chechnya is such a tight security military state. I think he probably felt more comfortable having a quick walkabout there than anywhere else. Other than Chechnya, I can't remember, and I'm sure Roland or someone else can correct me. I can't remember another instance he's been doing this, and he's had a walkabout in the last couple of months. So yeah, we've got to be careful, I think, with over promoting these walkabouts as Putin feels like he's in trouble.
Coming up, we all offer our final thoughts. Roland, you've been listening to what James has said there. Do you have anything to add or anything you want to leave our listeners with?
I think James covered that very well. One thing to remember about Chechnya is that Kadyrov is very much a product of Putin, and Putin needs him there, which is why James was talking about why it's important for Putin to demonstrate that this guy still has his blessing. But this is a long-term question that hangs over Russia, and along with the questions of what happens when Putin dies. One of the things is what happens to Kadyrov when Putin dies, and what will happen to Chechnya if Kadyrov disappears, as part of that answer with Adam Kadyrov being promoted and so on. But the real reason for that is that if you go down to Chechnya and it's an incredibly scary place in the sense that everybody's looking over their shoulder. When I lived and worked in Russia, I never felt that shadowed or followed or found it difficult to do my job. That was one place where people were like, no, we're not going to talk here. We'll meet over there, or we'll drive in a car or something like that. And if you were to just let the conversation flow, don't go in there asking journalistic questions and making sure I just went there, listen to people, let the conversation flow, and you remember just how bad the wars down there were. And you realize how everybody in that republic remembers perfectly well the Russian military did. Bubbling underneath, no matter how well it is suppressed, there's a huge amount of your feeling and trauma in Chechnya. And the question of what might happen when Putin goes, perhaps when Kadyrov is losing his grip, is a perennial kind of what-if headache at the back of anyone watching Russia. So it's just a note, and that's not something that's perhaps going to be relevant today, tomorrow, next week, or next year, but it's a serious thing. And just on that question, you were just talking to James about Putin's popularity, is maybe walking about, demonstrating that he still cares about mothers and young children, and there's the conscript issue and so on, and is Kursk putting him in trouble? My personal feeling about Kursk is that, okay, yes, it's not a great thing to see. Okay, yes, if he's got to cross the Rubicon of finally sending conscripts into combat, which was one aspect of the Chechen war, which was annoying to Russian society, something he's avoided perfectly. That is a problem. But on the whole, at this stage, I don't see the Kursk incursion necessarily as a serious problem for the Kremlin. And the reason for that is this. The Ukrainians have taken a chunk of territory, but it's mostly countryside, right? It's not Kursk city. And yes, it is the first invasion of Russian territory since Operation Barbarossa and so on and so forth. But it's really not that difficult for the Russians, for the Russian government, for Kremlin propaganda to play with that. They can talk about how they will return to the cult of 1941, about how the Germans invaded and for years and months part of the Soviet Union endured under occupation, but we went back and we got it. I don't think, because that cult is so deeply embedded in the current Russian national consciousness, it's not for me difficult to imagine the Russian public kind of accepting that, and that if that bridgehead doesn't advance too much further, for the Kremlin to think we can probably, in terms of public perception and public opinion, we can live with that Ukrainian lodgement there for a while.
Well, thank you very much, Roland. A really interesting perspective as ever. Tom, I'm delighted that you're still on air with us. You've been listening to a lot of what Roland and James have been saying there. Do you have any thoughts on any of that, or a final thought that you wish to leave listeners with today?
The final thought I want to leave people with, and it's a little bit about what Roland is saying about the sort of the significance of Kursk in a wider sense. And it's very true. Look, the Ukrainians have not taken any particularly strategically important territory. They're not really imperiling the movements of Russian troops or their logistics on fronts like Kharkiv or Donbass. However, I think it's important. A lot of people have called it a potential PR op, but I actually think that the value of that shouldn't necessarily be underestimated. Remember that in Ukraine, since about November 2022, when Kherson was liberated, there has really been very, very little in the way of good news. You've had the Donbass, you've had constant missile strikes, you've had the Russians chipping away in Donbass, little bits of territory at a time. You've had the failure of the counteroffensive last year. And finally, once again, Ukraine shows that it really can fight back and hit Russia where it potentially hurts. No, this is not going to probably bring down Putin or throw a huge wrench into the Kremlin's war machine, but I think it's a hugely needed morale boost for people in Ukraine and a reminder to Ukraine's Western partners that Ukraine still has a few cards and tricks up its sleeve.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for your insights. James, as always, a pleasure. What do you want to leave listeners with?
So I concur with what Roland was saying. Chechnya is absolutely critical for Putin. If you remember, he became Prime Minister in 1999, promising to sort out the Chechnya ulcer in Russia, and became president a few months later on New Year's Eve 1999-2000, taking over from Yeltsin. Again, with Chechnya very front and centre of his whole pitch. So I think him going down there now is hugely significant for him in his mind and the way Kremlin wants to protect him, project his persona as more of security in Russia. So your listeners have got to bear that in mind as well, what Putin's trying to do PR-wise. I would also sympathise with Roland's position on the impact of Kursk with the Russian public. What I've been reading and what I've seen is very, very easy for the Kremlin propaganda to basically spin this and go, look, we told you so. This is NATO invading. We told you they're up for this. And here we go. Everyone's got to get behind the crushing of Ukraine now. So that is going to be very interesting to watch play out and to see Kyiv take that. It's obviously been a military, very impressive, but PR-wise, and if their ambition is to unseat Putin, I also don't think this is the way to do it. Very lastly, Francis, I think it's really important while we're talking about diplomatic issues. The Chinese Prime Minister has been in Moscow this week, as well as Belarus, PM Prime Minister Li, and he's been not only meeting the Russian Prime Minister, but also with Putin. That's how important the bilateral relations are with China. And again, top of the list, according to Russian media that I've been reading, has been business ties. The yuan has become the most traded foreign currency in Moscow. Chinese banks have been vital, absolutely vital, for Russian companies to get access to international markets, to get an exchange. But fresh US sanctions, which came in last month, have made it more difficult for Chinese banks to deal with Russia and the ruble, and they basically jacked up the price of the trade. We see this happening in smaller countries like Kyrgyzstan as well. But again, very, very important visit to Moscow by almost number 2 guy in China, according to some analysts, who has been talking to Putin about how to smooth over this trade problems between Russia and China, which is so vital to the Kremlin.
Thanks, James. Now, if you missed yesterday's episode, I really recommend it. It already seems to have become something of a listener favourite after both Dom and Hamish admitted to invading several foreign countries by accident. But it's also worth it because of their reflections on the war in Bosnia in the 1990s, where they both served, and its implications for today. And in that vein, I wanted to end the episode, and my last while we're reporting live until next week, with an email from a listener who listened in yesterday. He's called Philip. I'm not a military man, journalist or politician. I'm just a simple primary school teacher who's been following the podcast since it began. My reason for writing is a reflection. A couple of weeks ago, I visited Bosnia. 30 years ago, a war zone with all the pointless suffering, destruction and death war brings. Today it has been rebuilt and tourism is booming. As I sat drinking a cold beer, I find myself thinking that one day Ukraine will be the same. At some point the killing will stop and talking will begin. One day there will once again be peace and cities will be rebuilt. One day the tourists will return. However, in the background will be the amputees, the mentally traumatised, the grieving parents, and those who are the victims of war crimes. Standing in Bosnia, 30 years on, reminded me once again how individual, evil men in power have the freedom to bring unbelievable destruction to millions. One day, this period will be referred to as a historical event. But what will we have learnt? Well, thank you, Philip, for that. And again, to every listener who reaches out to us via email, X, or indeed sometimes by letter, I really wish we could reply to them all. It's surreal, frankly, when we hear from someone who has been motivated to do something based on something they've heard in our reporting, whether volunteering to do something for Ukraine, writing to their congressmen or women, offering us their expertise. And just to end on one other example, you may recall I joined a convoy organised by the NGO Ukraine Focus, which delivers ambulances to the front line in Ukraine. I was with them for D-Day. Well, the NASA astronaut Terry Virts, who you may recall from his interview on the podcast, listened to that episode and then joined them on their subsequent expedition, along with other listeners, some of whom are French. And we thought as a team you might enjoy hearing from them after I regrettably retired my Francophile Francis moniker. Perhaps I need to change my mind. Over and out.
Francis, I'm here in Ukraine with my French friends, and they have something to tell you. Monsieur Francophile Francis.
Francis, on t'aime tous, on sait, on veut que tu restes francophile. Please stay with you, Francis. Please stay here.
Francis, stay francophile. We are from France and we stay. Nous aimons les francophiles.
Oui, bonjour Francis, nous aimons les francophiles. Live, grande vie au roi.
Long live the king.
Long live the king. Long live the king.
Francis, avec nous. Francis, avec nous.
Et vive Francis.
Francis, avec nous. Francis, avec nous.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it's released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following us on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we're relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X, formerly known as Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.